Reading Myanmar, an introduction. So just what is it that makes learning to read the Myanmar language difficult? You probably already have a few ideas about the answer to that question. So let's just review some of them. Probably near the top of your list is the fact that it does not use the Roman alphabet. So this course is designed for English speakers. We're used to the Roman alphabet, so to see letters like this, they're totally foreign. So before we can ever start to learn to read, we have to learn a brand new alphabet. Secondly, we've probably heard it's a tonal language, and that probably makes us fearful. We not only have to learn how to speak it, but how to identify it when we see it in writing. Third, it uses a very different word order. So this particular language uses the order subject, object, verb, or object, subject, verb. Verb is always at the end. That's different than what we're used to. The fourth reason is it takes a lot more words in Myanmar than it does in English to say the same thing, usually. Now, to demonstrate that, if you happen to have a Revised New World Translation in Myanmar and you set it next to an English, you'll see that it's about 30% thicker. Now, it's true the print presents some problems. It has to be spaced a little bit differently, a big enough print to be able to read, but it just takes more words. And the words sometimes aren't in a form that we recognize. We're familiar with nouns and pronouns and verbs. However, there's another kind of word in Myanmar. It's called a particle, and there are many of them. You'll have to learn what those are. Lastly, and this could be near the top of the list as far as I'm concerned, the words are not always separated. For instance, take a look at this sentence. Now, there are only 3 spaces in this whole sentence. You know what this sentence says? It says, the disobedient angels noticed beautiful women on the earth. There's only 3 spaces there. A number of words have been combined into what are called phrases. That makes reading difficult. So now we got all new letters. They scrunch up the words together. It takes more of them. Those are a lot of reasons. But now let's be fair. Let's consider some of the things that makes learning to read Myanmar easier. Now, we are not going to say easy, because particularly for English speakers, the Myanmar language is not easy. It's one of the more difficult languages in the world to learn, whether it's to speak it or to read it. But don't be discouraged. Let's just consider a few things that makes it a little bit easier for us. First of all, good news, it reads from left to right. A lot of languages that use foreign characters read the opposite. Secondly, there's no capitalization. That may not sound like a big deal, but look at the list here of large uppercase and lowercase letters in the English language. Really, that doubles the amount of alphabet that you have to learn in English because they take a different form. Also, there's no cursive form in the Myanmar language. You're going to see basic, I'll call them block letters, although they're rounded, but you're going to see those letters in the same form, so you only have to learn one form of that letter to be able to read it. Good news, in this language there is no gender to learn, as there are in many of the world's languages. There's a couple exceptions just in pronouns, a few pronouns, and also in a polite particle. Other than that, there's no gender to have to learn. Now, I think one of the biggest benefits is verb conjugation is much easier in the Myanmar language. Consider the word or the verb to go. In English, it has to be conjugated with many different kinds of words. Go, went, goes, are going, have gone, and there's others. So those are all different words you have to learn. They basically mean the same thing. They have to do with going somewhere. The good news is, in the Myanmar language, there is only one form of the verb to go. Just one. So how do you know what tense to use? There's the beauty of the language. There are individual words. This is one of the ways that this particle word is used. That's what they're called, particles. There are particles that are used that are placed with the verb to tell you whether it's future tense, past tense, present tense, perfect present, all of the tenses. And here is even better news. Those particles don't change. So once you learn those particles, they can be combined with any verb to conjugate that verb. So you only have to learn one form of the verb and the particles that give it tense, and you've got it. That seems a lot easier to me. So now let's discuss just a suggestion I have for the order in which to take the lessons that I've put together. They've all been completed and are posted. So the first lesson I'm suggesting is the alphabet. 33 consonants to learn. There are 2 lessons. The next lesson I suggest is the one on tones. There are 4 tones in the Myanmar language. I have them all included on one lesson. Now the vowels. I know this looks like a lot. It includes an introduction and 29 different lessons. The good news is most of all those lessons are only 2 or 3 minutes long. But I've separated them so that if there's vowels that you have a little bit of trouble with, you can just go back to that individual lesson. Next, I suggest you take the lesson on symbols, 3 different symbols and combinations. I've divided that up into 4 lessons. After that, stacked consonants. I'll talk a little bit about that a little later on. There's only one lesson to have to consider here. Next, some special exceptions, including consonant voicing and vowel weakening. And I've tried to keep these lessons in such a way, you probably see some terms here you may not know what they mean. I just take away those terms and explain them in terms you can understand. This is not a technical format for this lesson. I just want to give you the basic information you need to be able to learn to read. So let's talk about those individual lesson sets. Here you see in this picture a picture of the alphabet. That's how you're often going to see it. I'll explain in the lessons why that's so. There are 2 lessons that are considered here. So there's 33 consonants in the language. And really, the reason this should be first, this is the foundation for learning to read. So I really strongly suggest that you spend some time learning these consonants well before hurrying on to the next lessons. And one of those next lessons I suggest is the lesson on tones. So this lesson will introduce you to the 4 tones in the Myanmar language. I have them demonstrated over here on the right with the same consonant. They're all pronounced differently because they have different tones. Now the best way to learn tones is just to listen very carefully on any audio that you have and try to repeat them exactly as you hear them used. Don't worry if you don't get them right at the beginning. It takes some time to learn tones. That's why I suggest that you are introduced to the idea of tones, and then it's probably a good idea from time to time to come back and consider this lesson. As you begin to acquire words, you begin to learn how to read a number of vowels, then this lesson can be helpful all the way through all of your lessons. Okay, now we get to the bulk of the lessons, and that is the vowels. Look here on the right. Here's an example. 4 different vowels right here. It's not just one symbol. Sometimes they can be combined. And it's true, there are a lot of vowels and vowel combinations to learn. But there are very clear rules of pronunciation. So it just comes down to learning them. Some of these lessons also include vowels that end with an N sound. Kind of unusual as English speakers, but they're still classified as vowels. So that helps to explain why there's so many of these lessons. Okay, next, over here on the right, you see demonstrated some of the symbols that are used in the language. They're combined with consonants. There are 4 lessons here. They're added to the letters to produce a variation, a little bit different sound. Sometimes the symbols are combined. You actually see that in the symbol on the bottom here. But they only appear with certain letters. They aren't combined with all of the consonants, just some of them. It's not that difficult to learn the symbols. Now, stacked consonants. There are 4 of them here demonstrated. This is one of the more difficult lessons, but I've tried to break it down in such a way that it teaches you 2 very simple steps to be able to figure out how to pronounce what I think is a pretty unusual feature of the Myanmar language. Lastly, I have 2 lessons on some of the special exceptions that are used in the language. So these are 2 lessons that teach you how to shift the pronunciation of words. I say shift because sometimes the sound of a consonant is shifted, and there's rules for how to do that. Sometimes the sound of a vowel is shifted or weakened. So the 2 lessons, voicing consonants and weakening vowels, I try to give you a simple explanation that will cover many of the exceptions that you'll find to pronunciation. So they're exceptions, but there's actually rules you can follow to these exceptions. And all of these lessons should then equip you to get a really good start on being able to read. But I'd like to give you one last word of caution. And to demonstrate something, I'd like you to try to read this English sentence. Now, I have combined a couple of words together. That makes it a little bit difficult to read when there's no spaces between the words, like we said that there isn't in the Myanmar language. But I've also done something else here. There are 2 very obscure words used in this sentence. They're words. They're English words. I've never seen them. You probably haven't. You're free to look them up and see. I put this sentence together in a way that I think makes sense. But that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is, even in the language you know and have spoken all your life, if you don't know the words you're reading, then you're not going to be able to read it very well. Now, you know the rules of pronunciation, but of course sometimes there's exceptions to them in English too. There are a lot of times there are. So the key to being a good reader is to read words, not letters, not combinations of letters. It's to be able to read words. And to do that, you need to know the words. So I say this because sometimes there is the tendency for students to learn how to read, but never learn the words they're reading. And that's okay. They can read. That's a good skill to be able to read from God's Word, the Bible, is a beautiful skill to have. But to become a better reader, you'll need to learn what those words are. Not just to put meaning into them, but to be a more fluent reader. So the key to that, keep acquiring vocabulary. Really, considering these lessons in reading should not be done separate from learning how to speak the language. And the biggest part of learning how to speak the language is just learning the words that it contains. And that, honestly, is a years-long project. You will be able to learn to read from a technical standpoint, understanding rules of pronunciation, much quicker than you'll be able to acquire all the vocabulary you need to be able to be a fluent speaker in Myanmar. So keep acquiring vocabulary. That is really the key to improving your reading ability. So if I haven't scared you off by now, then please feel free to consider the lessons that follow. And if you do, as many students have been able to, you will be able to read Myanmar.